Thrown out at -20 degrees Fahrenheit, a poor boy built a haven inside a forgotten railcar. The door slammed so hard it rattled the frozen windows, and the sound echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. The boy stumbled backward into the snow, his breath ripping out of his chest in white, panicked clouds as the lock clicked from the inside. The cold wasn't just air, it was an attack. It clawed at his skin, burned his lungs, and crushed his bones all at once. Behind the door, voices rose and fell, muffled and final, while the boy stood there shaking, realizing with terrifying clarity that no one was coming back for him. At -20 degrees, every second outside was a countdown. He took one step, then another, boots crunching over ice that felt sharper with each breath. His fingers were already numb, his ears screaming with pain. His thoughts blurring as fear began to whisper its most dangerous lie. Lie down. Rest. Somewhere in the distance. Wind howled across the open land, and the boy understood something no child ever should, that if he stopped moving, if he gave in even for a moment, the cold would win. And tonight, the cold had no mercy. He didn't cry. Crying wasted breath. He pressed his chin into his torn collar and forced his legs to move, even as they screamed in protest. The town was silent, buried under snow and indifference, lights glowing warmly behind curtains that might as well have been walls of steel. He knocked once. Then again. No answer. A dog barked somewhere far away. A truck passed without slowing. Each rejection landed heavier than the snow piling on his shoulders. The boy's name was Eli, and until an hour ago, he still believed in endings that made sense. Now, all he had was the night. His hands shook uncontrollably as he crossed the abandoned lot at the edge of town, where the road dissolved into frozen weeds and rusted memories. The wind grew meaner there, unblocked, slicing straight through his thin clothes. Eli's vision tunneled, black creeping in at the edges. He knew the signs. He'd heard adults talk about them like warnings meant for other people. Dizziness, numbness, calm. The calm terrified him most. That's when he saw it. Half buried under snowdrifts, crouched like a dead animal against the white horizon, sat an old railcar. Its paint had peeled into jagged flakes, green and brown rust bleeding through like old wounds. Boards covered some of the windows. Others were shattered, black holes staring back at the storm. The tracks beneath it were gone, swallowed by time and ice, leaving the car stranded and forgotten. Eli didn't think. He couldn't afford to. He ran. His shoulders slammed into the metal side, pain exploding up his arm, but the shock snapped him awake. He staggered along the length of the car, fingers scrabbling against frozen steel, until he found a door that wasn't fully sealed. It resisted him, groaning like it resented being disturbed, but desperation made him strong. With a final shove, it cracked open just enough for him to squeeze inside. The air within was dead and stale, but it was still air. The wind dropped to a whisper. Eli collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving, body racked with violent shivers. For a long moment, he couldn't move. He lay there listening to his heart hammer, every beat of victory stolen from the cold outside. The railcar was empty, no seats, no lights, no warmth. Just shadows, splintered wood, and the smell of rust and rot. Snow filtered in through the broken windows, dusting the floor like a thin shroud. It wasn't shelter the way houses were shelter. It was barely a pause, but it was enough to keep him alive for now. Eli forced himself up, teeth chattering so hard his jaw ached. He rubbed his hands together, then stamped his feet, trying to remember everything he'd ever heard about surviving the cold. Movement, insulation, fire. The last one made him laugh weakly. Fire felt like a fairy tale in a place like this. He explored the car slowly, carefully, as if afraid it might collapse if he moved too fast. In one corner, he found old wooden crates, half rotted but still solid. In another, a torn tarp stiff with ice. Near the back, there was a small metal stove, ancient, dented, but unmistakable. Eli froze, staring at it as if it might vanish if he blinked. Hope was dangerous. But it was also warm. The stove was cold, empty, its pipe bent and clogged with debris. Eli didn't know if it worked. He didn't even know if he could make it work. But it gave him something the night had been stealing piece by piece, a reason to keep trying. He dragged crates together, stacking them away from the worst of the drafts. He layered the tarp over them, creating a crude barrier. Every movement hurt. His fingers burned, then went numb again, pain cycling into something dull and frightening. Still, he worked, because stopping meant dying. Outside, the storm worsened. Snow slammed against the railcar, rattling it on its forgotten bones. The sound was relentless, like the world trying to erase him. Eli pressed his back against the wall, pulling his knees to his chest, forcing warmth into the small space of his body. He thought about the door that had closed behind him, about the voice that had said, "You're not our problem anymore," about how quickly love had turned into ice. The thoughts threatened to drag him under, but he pushed them away. Tonight wasn't for remembering. Tonight was for surviving. Hours passed or minutes. Time lost its meaning in the cold. Eli scavenged what he could, breaking small pieces of wood from the crates, rubbing them together uselessly, hating himself for not knowing more. When exhaustion crept in again, heavy and seductive, he slapped his own face, whispered his name out loud, anchored himself to the sound of being alive. By the time the sky outside lightened from black to a pale, merciless gray, Eli had done something impossible. He was still breathing. The railcar hadn't become a tomb. It had become a boundary, the thin line between life and death, and Eli had held it through the longest night of his life. As dawn crept across the frozen land, casting weak light through the broken windows, the boy looked around the space he had claimed through sheer will. It was ugly. It was broken. It was cold. But it was his. And in the silence of that forgotten railcar, with frost clinging to his hair and hope flickering stubbornly in his chest, Eli made a quiet promise to himself. If the world was determined to throw him out into the cold, he would build something that refused to freeze. Morning did not bring mercy. It only revealed the damage. The light creeping through the cracked railcar windows was pale and cruel, exposing every weakness Eli had ignored through the night. His fingers were swollen and stiff, skin cracked and bleeding in places he hadn't felt at all. His boots were soaked, frozen into hard shells around his feet. When he tried to stand, his legs buckled and he slammed back onto the wooden floor, gasping as pain shot up his spine. For a terrifying second, he thought this was it. That surviving the night had only delayed the ending, but then something else cut through the pain. Anger, not loud anger. Not the kind that made people shout. This was sharp and quiet, burning deep in his chest. The kind that whispered, "No, not like this." Eli clenched his jaw and forced himself upright again, using the wall for support. The railcar groaned as if complaining, but it held. Outside, the storm had eased, leaving behind a white wasteland that stretched endlessly in every direction. No footprints. No roads. Just snow and silence. If he went back toward town now, he knew what would happen. Doors would stay closed. Excuses would come easily. Not our problem. Not safe. Not today. Cold didn't need permission to kill you. People just had to look away. So he turned his back on the town. Inside the railcar, Eli took stock of everything like a soldier after battle. Broken crates. Rusted stove. Bent pipe, torn tarp. A few scraps of cloth frozen into useless shapes. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had 12 hours ago. The stove haunted his thoughts. He crawled toward it, breath shallow, fingers trembling as he brushed snow and rust from its surface. The door creaked open, revealing ash and debris inside. Someone long ago had used this thing. That meant fire had once lived here. Fire could live here again, but fire needed fuel. And fuel needed effort. Eli wrapped his hands in the torn cloth and started breaking apart the weakest crate boards, snapping them over his knee. Each crack echoed in the hollow car, loud enough to feel dangerous, as if the sound itself might attract the cold back inside. Sweat broke out on his forehead despite the freezing air. Pain flared. He welcomed it. Pain meant he could still feel. Hours blurred together as he worked, stacking splintered wood beside the stove, tearing apart anything remotely flammable. He even scraped dried moss and old paper scraps from the corners, fingers numb, heart pounding with a desperate rhythm. Then came the hardest part, lighting it. Eli had no matches, no lighter, nothing magical. Just 2 stones he found near the stove, one chipped, one sharp, and a memory of something he'd once seen on television. He struck them together again and again, sparks flashing briefly, mockingly, then dying. Again and again. His arm shook. His vision swam. Each failed spark felt like another door slamming shut. One more time, he told himself. Just one more. The spark caught. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a thin curl of smoke rose from the paper scraps. Eli froze, afraid to breathe. The smoke thickened. A tiny flame bloomed, fragile and trembling, but alive. Eli laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound that turned into a sob halfway through. He fed the flame carefully, slowly, whispering encouragement like it could hear him. The fire grew, weak at first, then stronger, licking at the wood, radiating a heat so intense it hurt. He pressed his hands close, tears streaming down his face as feeling rushed back into his fingers like knives. It was agony. It was relief. It was proof. The railcar was no longer just shelter. It was a haven. By afternoon, the space felt different. Still cold, still broken, but alive. Smoke curled up the bent pipe and escaped into the sky. Eli reinforced the tarp wall, angling it to trap heat. He dragged crates into better positions, creating a barrier against the worst drafts. Every improvement, no matter how small, felt monumental. He was building something. Hunger hit him hard, a deep, hollow ache that made him dizzy. He hadn't eaten since the day before. His stomach cramped violently, reminding him that warmth alone wasn't enough. Survival demanded more. As evening approached, Eli forced himself back outside. The cold slammed into him again, but it felt different now. He wasn't helpless anymore. He moved with purpose, scanning the frozen land for anything useful. Near the tracks, half buried in snow, he found an old sack with a few dented cans inside, beans, peaches, labels faded but intact. Someone had abandoned them long ago. Eli nearly dropped to his knees in the snow. He carried them back like treasure, clutching them to his chest, guarding them from the wind. Back inside, he heated the beans directly over the fire, burning his tongue because he couldn't wait. The food tasted like metal and smoke and life. That night he slept in shifts, waking every hour to feed the fire, to stomp his feet, to whisper his name and remind himself he was still here. Dreams clawed at him, dark and sharp, but he fought his way back each time. Days passed. The railcar changed with him. Eli learned its sounds, its weaknesses. He patched holes with wood and cloth, packed snow into gaps to block wind, then let it freeze solid like mortar. He learned how much wood the stove needed, how to ration it, how to make the fire last. He learned pain, hunger, patience. He learned that loneliness could be louder than any storm. Sometimes he talked to the railcar, to the fire, to himself. Sometimes he screamed into the metal walls just to hear a voice answer back. The silence pressed down on him like weight. But he endured it the same way he endured the cold one breath at a time. On the 5th day, footprints appeared in the snow. Eli saw them through the cracked window and felt his heart leap straight into his throat. They were fresh, human, leading toward the railcar. Hope surged wild. Reckless. Then fear followed close behind. He killed the fire and crouched behind the crates. Breath shallow, every muscle locked tight. The footsteps grew louder. Shadows passed the windows. Voices murmured outside. Unfamiliar and sharp. Someone knocked on the railcar door. Eli didn't move. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the metal. "Hello?" A man's voice called. "Anyone in there?" Eli's hand shook. His mind raced. If he answered, what then? Help? Or another door slammed in his face? Were someone taking what little he had built? The handle turned. The door creaked open. Cold air rushed in. And with it, 2 figures stepped inside, men in heavy coats. Eyes widening as they took in the sight of a small boy standing defiantly beside a half-broken stove, fire scars on his hands. Fury and fear burning equally bright in his eyes. For the first time since the night he'd been thrown out, Eli didn't step back. He stepped forward. And whatever they expected to find inside that forgotten railcar, it wasn't this. Asterisk. The men stared at him like they were looking at a ghost that had learned how to breathe. Eli stood his ground. Legs shaking but locked, one hand wrapped around the metal poker he'd fashioned from a bent rod. His face was smudged with soot, his clothes stiff with frozen grime. But his eyes, those burned with something sharp and unyielding. Not fear, not anymore. The taller man recovered first. He lifted his hands slowly, palms out. "Easy, kid," he said, voice rough but not unkind. "We're not here to hurt you." Eli didn't lower the poker. The second man, older, with a gray beard crusted in frost, glanced around the railcar, taking in the patched walls, the stove, the careful arrangement of crates. His expression shifted from suspicion to disbelief. "You been living in here?" he asked quietly. Eli swallowed. His throat felt raw, like the cold had scraped it hollow. "I built it," he said. The word surprised even him. Built, not hid. Not survived. Built. The men exchanged a look. "How long?" The taller one asked. 5 days, Eli answered. Then, after a beat, 5 nights. The silence that followed was heavy. The older man removed his hat slowly, as if doing so too fast might shatter something fragile in the air. "Jesus," he muttered. "At these temperatures." Eli tightened his grip. "If you're gonna kick me out," he said, voice cracking despite his effort, "just do it fast." The taller man shook his head sharply. No, that's not." He stopped himself, exhaled. "We're railway inspectors. We check abandoned lines after storms. We thought this car was empty." "Well, it's not," Eli said. "And I won't steal from you. Everything here is mine." Another pause. Longer this time. The older man stepped closer to the stove, crouching to feel the faint warmth still clinging to the metal. His eyes softened. "You lit this yourself?" Eli nodded. "With stones?" Another nod. The man let out a slow breath. "Damn, they didn't take him." "Not then. They gave him food, real food, wrapped in paper that crinkled like something from another life. They gave him gloves, thick and dry, and a blanket that smelled faintly of engine oil and soap. They didn't ask too many questions. Maybe they were afraid of the answers. Before leaving, the taller man paused at the door. "We'll be back tomorrow," he said. "With help." Eli watched them disappear into the white distance. Heart pounding, unsure whether hope was a gift or a trap. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He sat by the fire. wrapped in the blanket, replaying every word, every look. Help had never lasted before. Help always came with conditions, papers, questions, decisions made without him. When morning came, the railcar shook with sound engines, voices, movement. They came back. And they brought others, a woman with a clipboard, a medic, another man with a camera. They talked softly, like they were standing in a church. Eli felt exposed, like every scar and mistake was suddenly visible. The medic checked his hands, his feet, his ribs. Frostnip, not frostbite. Dehydration. Exhaustion. You're incredibly lucky, she said, shaking her head. And incredibly stubborn. Eli didn't smile. The woman with the clipboard knelt in front of him. Eli, is it? She asked gently. He stiffened. How do you know my name? It was reported, she said. You were reported missing. That word hit him harder than the cold ever had. Missing. Not unwanted. Not forgotten. Missing. They wanted to take him to town. Warm bed. Hot food. Questions later. Eli listened in silence, eyes flicking to the stove. The walls he'd built, the place that had kept him alive when nothing else would. I'll go, he said finally. But I'm coming back. The woman hesitated. This railcar isn't safe long term. It saved me, Eli said simply. They didn't argue. Town felt unreal. Too warm, too loud. Too many people pretending not to stare. Eli ate until his stomach hurt, then slept for 14 straight hours. When he woke, snow was falling again, but this time he was behind glass. Days turned into weeks. Papers were signed. Stories spread. The boy who survived -20 degrees Fahrenheit alone. The railcar kid. People shook their heads and called it a miracle. Eli Dion single quotes T. He called it work. When they let him visit the railcar again, he brought things with him. Proper insulation. A real stovepipe. Tools. He worked alongside volunteers, showing them where the drafts hit hardest, where the snow packed best. They listened. The railcar changed again. So did Eli. He went to school during the day. He learned words for things he'd only felt before: resilience, resourcefulness, grit. At night, he returned to the railcar, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. It reminded him of who he was when no one was watching. One afternoon, as the snow began to melt, Eli stood outside the railcar, looking at the tracks stretching into the distance. He realized something then, something quiet and powerful. This place had not been the end of him. It had been the beginning, and the world, whether it was ready or not, was going to have to make room for a boy who refused to freeze, refused to disappear, and refused to be forgotten. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in like a thief stealing the sharpest edge of the cold first, loosening the iron grip the land had held for months. Snow softened into slush. Ice cracked underfoot. The railcar's rusted skin wept brown tears as it warmed, and Eli watched it all like a witness to a trial that had finally reached its verdict. He was alive, not barely. Not by accident. Alive because he had refused to surrender. The railcar was no longer forgotten. Workers from the town came every few days now. Not out of pity, but out of curiosity that had hardened into respect. They reinforced the underframe, sealed gaps in the walls, replaced shattered panes with thick plexiglass. Someone painted the exterior a deep forest green, leaving one rusted panel untouched at Eli's request, a scar he insisted should remain. This is where it almost beat me, he said. So I don't forget. Word spread farther than anyone expected. A regional paper ran a feature. Boy survives Arctic conditions in abandoned railcar. Then a national outlet picked it up. Then a morning show wanted an interview. Eli sat under bright studio lights, hands folded tightly in his lap. answering questions with the same calm seriousness he'd learned when every breath. How did you survive? They asked. I paid attention, he said. And I didn't quit. That line followed him everywhere. People wrote letters. Strangers sent tools, books, thick socks, handwritten notes that said things like "You're stronger than you know" and "Thank you for reminding us what courage looks like." Eli read everyone. He didn't respond to most. Some things didn't need answers. But not everyone was comfortable with his story. There were meetings. Closed doors. Adults debating what was appropriate, what message it sent to let a child keep returning to the place where he'd almost died. Eli listened from hallways, from corners, from behind doors that didn't close all the way. They talked about him like he was fragile glass. He wasn't. Finally, one evening, the woman with the clipboard, the one who had first spoken his name, sat down across from him with a tired smile. Eli, she said, what do you want? No one had asked him that before. Not really. He thought of the railcar, the stove, the nights when the wind screamed and he screamed back in silence. He thought of the fear that had almost crushed him and the pride that had grown in its place. I want to build things, he said. Places. So nobody has to freeze just because the world forgot them. That answer ended the debate. They didn't take the railcar away. They didn't turn it into a museum or fence it off like a relic. Instead, they helped Eli transform it into something new. A shelter. Not permanent housing, but emergency refuge. A place where someone lost in the cold could survive a night, maybe two, long enough for help to come. The rail line became monitored. A signal light was installed. Supplies were stocked and restocked. On the door, in careful painted letters, were words Eli chose himself. If you found this, you're not alone. The first time someone used it, Eli was there. A man in his 30s, disoriented, half-frozen, lost after his truck slid off an icy road. Eli watched from the doorway as the man drank warm broth, hands shaking, eyes glassy with shock and relief. You saved my life, the man whispered. Eli shook his head. No, he said quietly. I showed you where to stand until it passed. That summer, Eli learned carpentry. Real carpentry, not scavenged survival versions. He learned how load-bearing walls worked, how heat traveled, how design could mean the difference between shelter and trap. He absorbed knowledge the same way he'd once absorbed cold completely, relentlessly. He also learned about anger, the kind that comes late after the danger has passed. At night, sometimes he dreamed of the door that closed behind him the night he'd been thrown out. He dreamed of voices that told him he was nothing. He woke with his heart racing, hands clenched, breath shallow. But now, when he woke, there were walls that did not shake and people who stayed. Years passed. The railcar aged, but it didn't weaken. Neither did Eli. By 16, he was consulting on cold weather housing projects. By 18, he'd helped design modular shelters for disaster zones. Reporters still called him the Railcar Boy, but the name no longer felt small. It felt earned. On a clear winter morning, years after the night that had almost ended him, Eli stood alone beside the tracks again. Snow stretched white and endless in every direction. The railcar sat solid and steady behind him, smoke curling gently from its chimney. He placed a hand against its side. Thank you, he murmured. The wind answered, softer now. Eli turned toward the horizon, where new tracks led forward, not into exile, but into purpose. He didn't know exactly where they would take him. He didn't need to. He had already proven something the cold, the world, and fate itself could not argue with. Thrown out at -20 degrees Fahrenheit, abandoned by everything he thought he needed, Eli had built more than a haven inside a forgotten railcar. He had built a future. And no matter how harsh the storm, no matter how unforgiving the night, one truth would remain unmovable as steel on frozen ground. A boy who learns to survive alone can one day teach the world how to endure.